Still Oscar season, one more video on it. Want to go over the shorts. I like the shorts categories, part because they feel like underdogs, and part because I do actually like the short films as a slightly different style of filmmaking. They don't get a ton of attention. I want to do my part to give them some attention. Unfortunately, they're sometimes pretty difficult to find. I was only able to get my hands on 11 of them. Not a ton of the animated shorts. Wish they were more readily available, but unfortunately, the little short screenings that are in some theaters are not near me. I'll do what I can. So I'll rank them within the category based on how good they are, I suppose, or how good I think they are. I think it's a relatively weak slate this year, but, we'll still do it. So for live action, first I want to do an honorable mention, The Last Brunch, which is a short done by Jim Cummings. I love it. It's one of my favorite things I've watched this year. Not nominated or anything, but a live action short I love. All right, first, actual nominees. Anuja. A 9-year-old working in a sweatshop has a chance to attend school, but must make a difficult choice for her and her sister's future. This is an okay short. I think it's, nice enough. It's pleasant, but maybe it's just hard to follow the societal context that it's bringing. It doesn't really get into it that much, like what the education system is like. You can kind of infer some things about their situation. You can obviously tell they don't have a lot of money, but I guess for me, as I was watching, it was kind of hard for me to get like really grounded in that environment because I didn't feel settled in it based on what the film provided. I think there's some sort of weak filmmaking sometimes, like there's a sort of happy montage sequence that feels kind of commercial-ish. There's a sort of heist-inspired sequence, I think, that looks a little cheap but identifiable. So, it's not the worst thing in the world, but some moments that definitely feel a little lackluster to me. I think for a film that's trying to promote a certain social issue, it doesn't do a great job at it, but it's okay. It's not unpleasant. Next, The Last Ranger. Letha accompanies the last remaining ranger to a game reserve, where poachers ambush a wild rhino. Again, I think it's okay. I did learn that rhino horns are not just bone. It's actually quite brutal to cut it off, and I think that's the best quality, just the emotional impact of the attack, the poachers themselves. Besides that, the film is mostly like a sort of human drama, which I think is significantly less impactful than the actual, animal endangerment, the poaching and stuff like that. So, maybe if the movie was longer, there would be more time to make the dedicated human stuff feel a little punchier, but as is, I think it feels just slightly out of place and kind of drags things down broadly. Next, The Man Who Could Not Remain Silent. A train is stopped, and armed military forces board the train checking identification looking for Muslims. I like this one moderately. I won't spoil my favorite aspect because it kind of has to do with audience expectations and kind of an interesting way in which the movie uses that thematically. But besides that, I think it uses sound pretty well for tension purposes. Like when we're in this one train car, most of our information is just background sound, thumps and raised voices here and there. So I think it does a nice job at kind of trapping us in a spot that leaves tension while providing off-screen hints as to what's happening. That said, I don't think the tension ever works that well. Like I said, I like the idea, but it never really feels like the tension rises too high. It never feels like there's much of a dynamic payoff. I guess to me, it just kind of feels like a sequence of events that happens and then it's done. And that's just not all that punchy to me. But despite that, I think the execution is intriguing. Next, I'm Not a Robot. A music producer spirals into an existential crisis after repeatedly failing a CAPTCHA test, leading her to question whether she might actually be a robot. It's a pretty funny premise. I like the idea. Again, I won't spoil anything for this, but I think one of my favorite aspects is that the film actually is not about what you might expect. It has, the identity thing, the whole thing with the robot, but I think it also has another layer, which is perhaps more tangibly, applicable to modern society. Stuff like that. So I like that. I think sometimes it's shot a little bit too much like the thriller part of the movie because there are aspects of it that are more comedic, some that are more thriller. And I think the comedy stuff is often still shot like a thriller, and I don't think it fits that well. It's possible that was part of the sense of humor of the movie, but if that's the case, I'm just not on the wavelength of that. Maybe just creative differences there. I don't always disagree with the style, though. There are good moments. There's a nice long shot and some good nervous acting from the lead actress, I think specifically, that works really well. I like it. And then easily number one for me, and my favorite short of the slate that I've watched is Lien. On the day of their green card interview, a young couple confronts a dangerous immigration process. This is a stress movie, and I think the stress is done really well. The opening scene really just describes it perfectly. It's got, multiple activities happening at once. multiple voices, both human and electronic, talking over each other. Just like a lot of competing sonic and visual space. Plus the parents having to act normal in front of the kid. Still have a semblance of normality in what they're doing, despite all the stress, despite all the things going on that they're worried about. And those things that are depicted in the opening scene are the movie. Even though it gives you a nice, welcome, dynamic break for a bit, ramps it back up, not to an overwhelming degree, but to just like a stress-inducing degree the whole time. Big fan of that. Big fan of the way it executes the stress and the anxiety. I do think sometimes the edit gets a bit choppy. That's why it's not like a great movie or anything to me. I think it sometimes toes the line between the fast cutting for disorientation of feeling the character's headspace and just being disoriented by fast cutting. Sometimes the cuts are mistimed, I think, a little bit to give some things a more comedic feel than dramatic feel. Just a few exceptions, and I think the film largely succeeds at what it's going for. All right, here's documentary shorts. Was not able to find Death by Numbers. It is about a survivor of the Parkland school shooting who prepares to confront the shooter at the trial. Seems to have decent enough reception. Next, I Am Ready, Warden. The short deals with death row inmate John Henry Ramirez and the impact of his imminent execution on people entangled in his life. This is an interesting short because of the reaction primarily, or at least one reaction that people might jump to. There are elements of religion in his life, and especially in the life of his godmother. I don't think it's the film's attempt to persuade you that he is, he's like good to go now just because he found Jesus. I think there's no attempt to dodge what he did. And instead, Christianity is just an aspect of mostly just one person who is entangled in his life, basically. Christianity is kind of the lens through which she views him, through which he views his guilt, whether he deserves the death penalty. We get another couple of perspectives that feel differently, and they all point towards, including the godmother, questioning the death penalty. It's not questioning because he is a good person now. It is questioning because of the people involved in his life, both positively and negatively. It's questioning because a murderer can still have loved ones that are going to be harmed. It's questioning because two wrongs don't make a right. So I think that's the point, and that's the important thing that the film tries to get across, rather than just a specifically religious purpose. The real problem for me, though, is that the film is just not very good. It's kind of blandly and kind of annoyingly presented. The visuals pretty much never do anything positive, except the choice to keep like one shot rolling for a bit continuously. There's plenty of generic, unhelpful visual filler, generic one-tone emotive score, which you can probably picture in your head, the synth one, not the piano one. And additionally, John is not necessarily the best at expressing himself. So in some of those moments, I think what the movie hopes to accomplish does not work very well because John is kind of like undoing some of their ideas with what he's saying. Next, The Only Girl in the Orchestra. This is a short biopic of double bassist Orrin O'Brien, the first woman musician in the New York Philharmonic. Orrin seems likable enough in the film, and there's some wild recollection of some things that are written about her, said about her. It speaks more to her outlook on life and her life philosophy than it does necessarily to her career. It does a little bit of both, but it feels, perhaps more philosophical than historical. So, just to me, I guess, I don't think there's all that much about this movie that really sticks with me. It doesn't feel like it has much of an identity. It doesn't feel like a movie that has strong weaknesses, but it certainly doesn't have strong strengths in my mind. So it exists, and that's fine. Next is Incident. Incident presents body cam footage associated with a 2018 shooting of a black man in Chicago, documenting Chicago PD's actions immediately preceding and following the shooting. The subject matter is disheartening and tragic. There's not much for me to say about it. It is what it is if you watch it. But, as a film, I can only imagine like the editor's nightmare that this must be to put together. Because, it's the whole movie is just an assembly of footage arranged in what, the editor deems to be the most helpful way. Unfortunately, I don't really think the editing works all that well. Some split screen stuff I don't think works out great. I think there's probably a lot of footage to show that he really wanted to get across. He gets a lot of stuff in there. I think it's too much. I think it's not streamlined enough like it should be. There are times where we get some stuff that's sort of overwhelming, some stuff that's assembled together, like multiple perspectives, multiple sources of audio. That is somewhat overwhelming and disorienting, perhaps. In some types of movies, that's fine. Like sometimes that's a perfect effect, especially in more narrative stuff. But I think here, this kind of movie needs maximum clarity, because the benefit of having this body cam footage is to be able to hold public servants accountable, right? So I think maximum clarity is more helpful for that, for correctly and concisely establishing what happened, how it happened, who is responsible, stuff like that. And having a more emotional assembly of footage is not the primary benefit of this sort of film. So I think to me, the presentation just needs to be more straightforward, more direct, more documentarian, I guess, for lack of a better term in some spots. Not that it doesn't feel like a documentary, it clearly is, but there are moments where it just feels like the emotional impact is the goal, not the factual impact. Last documentary short is Instruments of a Beating Heart. First graders in a Tokyo elementary school are presented with a challenge for the final semester, performing Ode to Joy at a ceremony for new incoming first graders. Probably a good finale for the documentary shorts, because this one is significantly more light, fun, positive, uplifting, whatever, than the other ones that came before it. Honestly, this kind of feels like the filmmaker is flexing the institution's capabilities, and totally fine with me, totally on board with praising good educators, good systems, stuff like that. The short is not just focusing on the fun. It's not just focusing on the process itself, the education in music, but I think it's also demonstrating how people are formed in schools. And some of the lessons the kids are being taught are not just school lessons. They're not just music lessons. They're life lessons. These are the stepping stones to becoming, model citizens. And I think some of the things the film chooses to show help support that idea. So I really appreciate that depiction, in addition to the fun of watching. All right, last, only got 2 animated shorts, but I like both of them. In the Shadow of the Cypress is a film about a former captain struggling from PTSD, living with his daughter in a humble house located by the sea. And together, they live an isolated life. Striking animation, visually distinctive, and the film takes a bit of a figurative approach. I think there's a lot to chew on with symbols, the way the film chooses to stitch certain things together. So I think most of the material you could get from watching this, most of the discussion, is due to specific story beats. So I won't get into all of that. I think it's a nice, thought-provoking film that deserves to be here. I think this is a good selection. And the last one is Yuck. A group of kids roves a resort, being disgusted by couples kissing. One of them realizes that maybe he wants to give it a try. This is a little short, partially about starting to grow up, and partially about how kids kind of behave with each other. Most kids have the phase, certainly I did, where, the opposite sex or whoever it winds up being is gross, and, you kind of don't want anything to do with them. You don't want to get married, be in a relationship, whatever. A lot of people eventually have that point where that starts to flip. They start to see something in the people or whatever. So it's kind of fun to watch that, just get like a little bit of a childhood memory of like that time in life where things started to shift in your perspective. But it also captures this dynamic of being a kid, of wanting to fit in, but also needing to break away at the same time, of the way that these kids kind of have to, quote unquote, have to act a certain way to be, friends with each other, but still like secretly have that desire to break away from the group. And kind of like that push and pull, the importance of having friends, but also understanding the importance of being individualistic at times. So I think it wraps up all these kid issues in a likable way. And I think the short's just enjoyable to watch. It's got a really great track for the scenes that have kissing in them. It's kind of like dreamy and anticipatory. So I think that was a great choice and adds to those scenes very well.